let's start off the class by turning the recording on, and let's do a very, very quick recap of what we talked about last class, which was pricing and aspects associated with pricing. And that, of course, was our first part of the pricing session. And then, of course, tonight we want to pivot into our second session on pricing. So we started off last class talking about that very important P, pricing. And we started off talking about different aspects of it. We first of all, reminded you about that fairly lengthy discussion that we had about pricing during our session number 1, actually. We had a long chat about pricing at that time, so we sort of reminded everybody about that, talked about what price is, what it means to us as consumers, what it means to us as marketers, and we made the point that there is a lot of information packed into that notion of price. So it is very much a value-laden quantity. There's a lot of information packed into that notion that we call price. And not only is that important, but also, as I keep saying to you, the context in which we present price to the consumer is critically important. And so that was those were a couple of points that we emphasized a lot last class. We also emphasized the very important point that price, like the other P's, frankly, but especially price, fundamentally flows out of our overall marketing strategy, right? So we remember that. So it's not something that we just contrive, in isolation. It very much has to flow out of our overall marketing strategy. So yeah, we talked about price. We recognize that it's a remarkably powerful tool, that we can do a lot with it. It does a lot for us. We talked about different types of pricing. We talked about that notion that we call price discrimination, right? We'll talk a little bit more about price discrimination tonight, by the way. We talked about price discrimination, what it is, how it works. We also very quickly, recognized the emergence of what we call price bands that tend to emerge when we see that clustering kind of an effect around brands based on particular attributes or key attributes such as quality, for example, and how that clustering effect can occur based on quality, say, or other attributes, and price, right? So we talked about that. And then we introduced 3 notions to you, well, 3 terms that capture the same notion, really. And that was perceived value, customer value, and reservation price. And we suggested that those 3 terms really mean the same thing in this context, which really is all about the maximum amount that the consumer is willing to pay for a product. So we talked about that. Good for us to know, right? As marketers, we need to know that. How much? What is the maximum amount that a consumer is willing to pay for something? We need to know that. So we talked about that. We talked about the relationship of perceived value as it relates to price and as it relates to cost. And so there were 3 scenarios we talked about at that point. So we talked all about that. And then we said, okay, well, that's all kind of cool, but where do we price our products? Where do we determine price? And then it was at that point that I introduced that little graphic that I called the strategic pricing gap, suggesting that within that strategic pricing gap, there is a ceiling and a floor. In other words, the ceiling is reservation price or customer value, the maximum amount that a consumer is willing to pay for something. In other words, the point beyond which we can't set a price because nobody will buy it. We established that. And of course, the floor, which is captured by our cost, we can't set a price below that, otherwise we're losing money, obviously. So we don't want to do that either, generally speaking. So the question then became, where in that strategic pricing gap do we set our price? Fundamental marketing question. And so we talked about that. And we raised a whole bunch of issues there. We said, okay, well, One option is to price to value, which is setting our price at the highest level, right? And in so doing, then, if we were to do that, we would capture that entire pricing, strategic pricing gap as profit, essentially, for ourselves, versus letting some go to other channel members if we were to price it lower. It's an option. We might want to do that. We might not want to, depending on a whole bunch of other things, right? So we talked about that. So basically, though, this notion of where to set price and how price affects quantity demanded is a key issue. And that then is pretty well where we left off last class by asking that fundamental question. And the answer to that fundamental question really resided within basic economic theory of supply and demand. And specifically, it was price elasticity of demand. So again, I'll say it again now for the third time. When we talk about price elasticity of demand, it answers that fundamental question for us. What will be the resultant change in quantity demanded in response to a change in price, right? Key thing. If we're going to tinker with price, what's going to happen to the quantity demanded? That's the kind of thinking we need to apply as marketers, yeah? So, yes, very important, and it is absolutely related to that other very important marketing notion that we call substitutability. So, recognizing that, again, last class, what did we do? We talked about price elasticity of demand, whereby we gave you essentially how price elasticity of demand works and what it really is by definition. And so by definition, you see it right here on the slide. And so last week, as we said, we have this kind of an arrangement so that if we look at this from a conceptual perspective, a relativistic perspective, we ask ourselves, okay, if we have a situation where there is a relatively large change in price, what effect will that have on quantity demanded? So if we have a large change in price that results in a comparatively small change in quantity demanded, what kind of situation do we have going on then? Large change in price, small change in quantity demanded. Small numerator, large denominator. What does that mean? That means lower than 1, which basically means inelastic. So in that kind of situation, we have inelasticity, right? Conversely, we can have sort of the opposite, right? We can have a small change in price that results in a large change in quantity demanded. So what then do we have? We have something that is large in the numerator, small in the denominator, and therefore by definition it is larger than 1, the ratio numerator denominator, and therefore what do we call that? Elastic. So we have that we call elastic. So there is somewhat high elasticity in that case. So you see then how this is very important. So that is pretty well where we ended off last class, but I want to drill into this in a little bit more detail. And specifically then what I want to do, again, to really drive it home, is to show you some extreme cases of it that we call perfect elasticity and inelasticity. Whenever, from an economic perspective, whenever we talk about elasticity, it always helps to look at the two extreme cases of perfect inelasticity and perfect elasticity, and it helps us to even further understand these important notions in more detail, and that's what we want to do. So what I want to do then is to share my screen with you. And there we have it. And so here, this is what we have then. So again, what are we doing here? We're reverting back to our basic economic theory of supply and demand that you essentially see on the board there. And without getting into the details there, we basically have, again, that direct relationship between price and quantity, which is supply, and the supply curve. And then, of course, we have on the flip side, we have our demand curve, which is an inverse relationship between price and demand, specifically quantity demanded, suggesting that the higher the price goes, the lower the quantity demand is. Makes sense. We know that. So therefore, recognizing that, we could look at a couple of relationships here. And this I just plucked off of line here just to save us a little bit of hassle in drawing it ourselves. But first of all, we can look at perfect idealistic kind of cases. First one is that condition that we call perfect inelasticity of demand. So when we look at that, what do we have? Essentially, we have that vertical curve, right? So under that perfect elasticity, that perfect idealistic condition, we have essentially a vertical demand curve. Now, nothing in life is ideal, right? So in reality, we have something like this, which is still a very steep, highly sloped negative curve that we see here. So what are we saying then? Again, if we have a change in price from say P1 to P2, relatively, it is a large change in price from P1 to P2. So we start off P1, what type of quantity does that yield? It yields a quantity Q1. We change the price to P2, and what does that yield? It yields Q2 quantity. So again, what do we have? We have a situation where we have a large change in price that results in a small change in quantity demanded. So what then do we have here then? We have a situation again where we have, the elasticity is less than one, so to speak. And what kind of commodities then does that reflect? What does that reflect in reality? Well, we're living in a condition right here and now, which is a classic example of what's happening here. We have a large change in fuel, and is that really affecting the quantity demanded? Not really, not really, not really, for all intents and purposes. So therefore, why does that exist? Well, it's all about substitutability. And so consumers, even with that large change in price, it really doesn't affect the quantity demanded. Why? Because we can't substitute, oil or gas for another product. So it's not substitutable. Medications, pharmaceuticals, some pharmaceuticals are classic examples of those conditions that in fact are, as we call them, inelastic from an elasticity perspective. So they're highly inelastic. So oil, gas, those kind of things, highly inelastic. Why? Because a big change in price won't result too much in a change in quantity demanded. Standing in contrast to inelasticity is that other condition, extreme condition that we can call perfect elasticity. So under that perfect elasticity, what do we have then? Again, ideally, we have that horizontal demand curve, but in reality, we have sort of a very shallow curved or a sloped demand curve, which looks something like this. So what are we saying here then? The opposite end, what do we have? Well, we have a very small change in price where we have P1 initially stimulating quantity 1, quantity demanded, Q1, and we have that change of price to P2 resulting in Q2 demand. So what do we have here? We have a relatively small change in price, resulting in a relatively large change in quantity demanded. So we have that kind of a situation going on here. And so what do we have here? We have, the delta P being much smaller than the delta Q, which of course is greater than 1, and that really indicates elasticity. So yeah, in this case, the commodity is highly elastic. So what would be an example of something like that? Little change in price results in a big change in quantity demanded. How about something like our colas, right? Coke flips their price either a few cents higher or lower for a bottle of Coke. What's going to happen? Generally speaking, consumers who are drinking Coke, they're going to flip right out of Coke if they pop the price up, and they'll flip right over into some other cheaper option, right? So Coke then would see a very dramatic increase in quantity demanded if they increase their price just a little bit, right? And here I'm talking about an ideal sense here conceptually. Set aside the realities of, loyalty for Coke drinkers and that kind of a thing. But generally speaking, that's the case, yeah. So we have that kind of situation going on. So something like your colas, highly, highly substitutable. How about something like haircuts, barber, lawn care services, that kind of a thing, right? Little change in price, people will just bail and get somebody else, right, to cut their lawn or whatever, right? So these kind of commodities, then, if you will, are highly elastic, so to speak, as we call them. Beer is another one, right? Beer, generally speaking, most beer is highly elastic. So therefore, a little change of price and boom, consumers will flip over into something else if it goes up or down or whatever. So yeah, we have that kind of a thing. Fairly simple concepts, right? Elasticity, very, very important though. So price elasticity of demand, very important concept for all of the reasons that we mentioned. So let's go back to our slides. So we recognize then that, further to what we were talking about, where in the strategic pricing gap do we want to price our products, right? We've talked about how if we change price within that, we've spoken about some of the potential resultant effects here in terms of demand. What about pricing, below costs? Or what about using costs as a means of setting our price? So that could be problematic, right? Although we recognize that some industries tend to use costs as a primary basis for setting price. For example, by the way, if you have plans to build a house and you go to a contractor or builder and say, here are the plans for the house, build me this house, how much will you charge? They will take it away, they'll do a cost analysis, which will basically be primarily based on, the cost of materials and their sub trades and that kind of a thing. And they'll come back and say, okay, it'll cost me this amount and I'll add on a certain percentage and this will be the price to you. So some industries do that, and I'm not saying that's a good way of doing it either, by the way, but whatever. I tend to think that some of these guys, they tend to either overcharge or undercharge, because they fundamentally use a very crude way of determining price for consumers. But anyway, the question then becomes, well, if we do use costs, what about it? How does it work? Well, the first point to mention is that, as I said, typically we don't want to price below cost, because if we price below cost, we're losing money. Generally speaking, we lose money, we go out of business, and that's not a good thing, right? So we want to price higher than the price floor. Generally speaking, as I mentioned last class, by the way, there are some exceptions as to when we might want to engage in that. There's a principal kind of a tactic that we call loss leader, and we sometimes do engage on a very small scale, engaging in that loss leader kind of a pricing tactic, where we absorb a small loss on particular items, particular products, but generally we don't do that. At any rate, using cost is problematic, and primarily because it really ignores the role of the consumer. And one of the things that I am always emphasizing here is that pricing fundamentally is an exercise in applying psychology. And by looking solely at costs, it ignores the role of the consumer. So it's very problematic from that perspective. Furthermore, when we look at costs, it makes us realize, well, what costs do we include in our assessment of costs overall? Do we look at fixed costs, variable costs? Do we consider R&D costs, costs of goods sold, et cetera, overhead costs, et cetera, et cetera? What do we include? What should we include, right, in that? So that can be somewhat problematic here. And we realize, of course, that, further compounding the issue here, especially when we talk specifically about variable costs, costs certainly do change in terms of volume produced, generally speaking. So if we set prices purely on costs, it's very problematic for these reasons. So therefore, how do we set the price, and what kind of things do we consider when we're engaged in setting price? Well, there are a whole lot of things that we need to consider, right? There are a whole lot of things that we need to consider and understand as we proceed to setting price. We have to first of all ask ourselves, what stage are we at within the product life cycle? Recognizing that as marketers, we tend to do different things in terms of our 4P configuration. We set up our 4P framework, our 4P configuration, doing different things at different stages of the product lifecycle. So at the introduction stage, for example, we set up our 4Ps differently from, say, if we're at the maturity or decline stage, right? And that's especially true for price. When we talk about different objectives or tactics that we use, there's numerous options available to us. We can engage in penetration or skimming. We'll talk about those. We could look at different marketing metrics such as ROS, ROI, for example. We'll talk about those. We could have a look at what the competition is doing. We'll talk about that momentarily also. So anyway, we need to consider that. What are our overall pricing objectives? What do they have to be? We also want to consider what's happening within the industry anyway. What's happening within the industry? What kind of competition exists within the industry? And here we can defer to, a set of 5 major questions that will help inform us as to what's happening in the industry. And so here we see 4 or 5 major factors here, which correspond to our friend Michael Porter out of Harvard, Porter's 5-force model there, right? So we have that in a consideration of that. We also recognize, and we will talk about these later in tonight's session, the more pure psychological aspects of pricing. And we'll talk about these, different artificial price points, reference price, and the role of that, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line here is that it is up to the decision maker. It's that human managerial process that's involved, that should be involved in setting price in recognition of all of these things that we're talking about, right? So it's a key thing. So when we're involved in setting price, we need to think about all of these things and not only think about them, but understand them and understand their impacts, right? And so that's, primarily our approach here and what is important. So as we look at some of these pricing objectives then that are very important, we can look at, initially two major aspects here, and that is penetration and skimming. And when we look at penetration, what's penetration all about? Well, penetration is basically, at its core, pricing low, relatively speaking. Conversely, skimming as a tactic is pricing high, right? So we have that. So yeah, we'll talk about those in a second here in a little bit more detail, because those are two fundamental tactical options, if you will. We can also think about using some marketing metrics such as ROS, return on sales, or ROI. So we can think about that too. Problem with that is that it, again, like I said before, it tends to ignore the consumer, and importantly, it ignores those critically important psychological aspects of pricing. So therefore, while we want to understand, realize, use, employ, consider, the array of marketing metrics that we have available to us, such as ROS, ROI, and others, we don't want to rely exclusively on these metrics for the reasons that I just mentioned. We could also look at competitive aspects too. In other words, what is the competition doing in the marketplace, and price accordingly? We can do that. Maybe we want to undercut the competition. Maybe we can do that. Maybe it's in our best interest to do that if we can establish an appropriate costing structure whereby we can undercut the competition. Great, maybe, depending, right? But the problem though with that is that we might inadvertently enter into a pricing war, right? And that is something we may or may not want to engage in if we start undercutting the competition. And if we, charge more, then it'd be that much more difficult for us to gain market share relative to the competition. So we need to think about these kind of things, right? When we talk about sort of establishing, a competitively based pricing scenario, which again is perfectly reasonable, but we have to do so in recognition of all of the other things that we're talking about also. So when we talk about penetration pricing, as I said, what did I say it was? I said that it was pricing low. So when might penetration pricing be appropriate? When might it be appropriate? Well, it would be appropriate if we want to very quickly build up market share, right? Pricing low, we know from basic supply and demand, generally speaking, when our price is low, that tends to stimulate quantity demanded. And so therefore, you price low, especially at product introductory stage, we can very rapidly build up market share. That might be a good thing. We may want to do that, right? So that would be good. And accordingly, if we do build up market share, that would leave less of the market available to the competition, right? However, the thing is that when we see that pricing, or when the competition sees low pricing like that, it might not be. Well, let me rephrase it. When we price low like that, it would likely not be particularly attractive for the competition to enter. So therefore, if we price low, chances are we don't have to worry too much about the competition entering, because it would be seen as not being particularly attractive from a profitability perspective, right? From the point of view of the competition. So that's okay, right? That's, worth noting. Also, the competition, in addition to it not being particularly attractive, because you're presumably accepting lower margins when you're pricing low. It would be that much more difficult for the competition to enter the market and price low themselves. So again, it's not, we don't have to worry too much about new market entrants when we are engaged in market penetration. So that might be a positive thing for us, in other words. It is also another positive thing for us, pricing low, is that it might be a very strong choice when scale effects come into play and when we can take advantage of scale effects. So, in other words, here we're talking about economies of scale. And I will remind you, when we talk about economies of scale, what are we talking about? We're talking about how that per item total cost goes down as a result of greater production, higher quantity produced, and therefore what we can do then is we can spread our fixed cost over more units, therefore reducing the total cost and in turn lowering the overall cost, and in turn then allowing us to engage in this pricing low notion that we're talking about, right? Still generating revenue as quantity demanded goes up and sales go up. So under those circumstances, for those industries, it might be quite appropriate. So what would be an example of an industry that's characterized by those economies of scale where penetration might be appropriate? Well, just think about our first case that we did together on the brewing industry, right? We talked about global branding of Stella Artois. We made the point that the brewing industry is very much like that, right? The more you produce, the lower your cost per unit can be, because in brewing, as you know, you have this very, very high initial capital cost, very high fixed cost. So you produce more, you spread that fixed cost over more units. Characteristic of brewing, right? So the brewing industry, especially on an international kind of a scale like that, is very much subject to those scale effects. Other kinds of some manufacturing also are very similar to that. However, on the downside, pricing low might not be appropriate for those product categories that are characterized by that price quality relationship, right? So yeah, you wouldn't want to do that. So you won't see, a Canadian brand manager or North American brand manager for Rolex introducing a new model of a Rolex watch and pricing it low, right? That won't happen, you know. So yeah, again, for those product categories that are characterized by, price quality relationship, not a strong choice at all. So, you know, another downside when we talk about penetration and pricing low is that it limits our flexibility to the extent that once you price low, especially a product introduction, it becomes very difficult to price it high later. You know, increasing price is always difficult, yeah, generally speaking. So it limits our flexibility in that regard, generally speaking. Now, there are ways around that. Next class, in fact, we'll talk about different types of promotional efforts and different tools that we have. But the bottom line is that if we want to increase the price later, there are ways by which we can do it. We can introduce some kind of a sales promo, for example, to cushion that price increase, like a couponing program that can be quite beneficial if we're going to increase the price. So we can do it, but it does limit our flexibility if we price low. So that's another downside to penetration pricing. And of course, as I had alluded to, always, 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 whenever we set price or do anything with price, change it or anything, we always have to remember what will be the effect on that most, as I say, that most sacred of things in marketing, the brand. What will be the effect on the brand? So, penetration pricing, right? Key thing, we need to consider it and consider it in relation to all of the points that I'm mentioning here. What about something like skimming? How does that work? Well, again, skimming is where we, conversely, price high, generally speaking. And so, yeah, that might be quite an appropriate tactic when we're talking about that product category that is characterized by that price quality relationship. So, yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the diamond industry, perhaps some jewelry. We're talking about luxury vehicles, luxury cars, luxury items. We're talking about high-end brands, garments, the apparel industry. If we're talking about watches, yeah, setting that price high might be quite appropriate, right? Price quality relationship. It might be quite appropriate when there is little chance of future competition, right? For example, when we look at the pharmaceutical industry, when a new medication, a new drug is introduced, it can enjoy numerous years of patent protection, meaning that legally another competitor firm can't take that patented, branded, trademarked drug, reverse engineer it, and whip up a generic, a no-name product and flood the market with the cheap no-name. But that's illegal, right? Can't do it because it's under patent protection. And so, depending on the nature of the drug, it used to be upwards of 20 years. That was changed to about 15 years. So some advanced drugs are still 15 years. Other ones are, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, depending. But the bottom line is that when a new drug is introduced, it can enjoy a period of time whereby it is legally protected. And so therefore, the pharmaceutical company can engage in skimming and price high. And of course, in that industry, it's particularly important because the cost of R&D of new drugs is just so incredibly high. I mean, it can take years and years to bring a new drug to market as it goes through the various phases of trials leading to eventually FDA approval in the US or Health Canada approval in this country. So it takes a long time and it can cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, right, to develop a new drugs, right? So it's a very expensive thing, very, very R&D intensive. So what does that mean? And that means then that these large pharmaceutical companies have to price high in order to recoup their R&D costs, in other words. So yeah, under those conditions, certainly, skimming might be quite appropriate. Yeah. Now the thing is too, is that when we're pricing high, getting back to the competition, as I had talked about before, if you're pricing high, what does that look like to the competition? Well, it looks like, higher margins perhaps. And if that is seen by the competition as such, that can be very attractive to the competition. And so accordingly, that might stimulate new market entrants and increase the competition accordingly for that reason. So that might be a downside. That might be something to consider. So at any rate, bottom line here is that again, like penetration and like any other aspect associated with pricing, we always have to consider the effect that it will have on the brand. Very important. So here then we've spoken about these sort of tactical options that we have available to us here. So let's step into more psychological approaches in a little bit more detail here. And in order to do that, let's reconsider, and I'll say reconsider because we've already considered it several times in the course so far, most notably during our session number 1. And you'll remember during our session number 1, we talked about pricing. You saw these pictures before. We talked about reference price and the importance of reference price. So the first thing I want to emphasize to you is please do not get reference price confused with perceived value or customer value or reservation price, as we spoke about before. Different things. Where the former terms have to do with the maximum amount the consumer is willing to pay for something. Here, we're talking about that internal, typically that internal reference for price, which is reference price, right? That standard of comparison against which the potential transaction or purchase price is compared. In other words, a reference price is that standard that exists in the mind of the consumer as to what he or she deems to be fair and appropriate. That's what a reference price is. So, last time I talked about my Tim Hortons coffee, what would be a fair and appropriate price? Maybe $2 is about fair and appropriate, because I realize that, there is overhead associated with it, so I get that. So I think probably for me, a reference price is about $3 for that extra large coffee. Whereas, like I said before, my reservation price is $3, right? But like I said, my reference price is about $2 maybe for that. So yeah, I think that would be probably about fair and appropriate, So yeah, so we have that going on. So can marketers proactively affect the establishment of the reference price in the mind of the consumer? Or as marketers, do we have to just sort of sit back passively and wait and hope for the best? Well, the answer is that as marketers, absolutely, we can lean forward and establish a reference price. And as you see in the pictures here, this is an attempt on the part of the marketer to lean forward and absolutely establish the reference price in the mind of the consumer. And that's what we're doing right here. Yes, we can, and we do. And this is how we do it, by presenting price like that. ESAM. So yeah, using anchor and adjust. So what goes into the establishment then in the consumer's mind of a reference price? A whole bunch of things, right? Not the least of which is, past purchase history, purchase experience, comparison of comparable products, word of mouth. Expectations are huge, right? Expectations, if you are expecting a price drop for Black Friday electronics, right? You might hold off purchasing your electronics, say, or other products in anticipation of a price drop for Black Friday. And of course, we realize how some retailers take measures to avoid that too, by the way. For example, as we know, Best Buy, pumps out the flyers and says, this is our lowest price. These are our Black Friday prices that are available to you right now. And by the way, it won't drop any further, so you can buy it now and you don't have to worry about it. And by the way, if it does drop lower, let us know and we will give you the balance back, right? We'll reimburse the balance up until the 16th of January. So yeah, that is an example of a retailer attempt to circumvent that and stimulate purchase, right? So yeah, we have that playing into reference price and the establishment of reference price. I might have told you in the past also. I mean, pre-COVID and pre microchip shortage days, before supply chains were sort of sent into a state of disarray because of the microchip shortage and COVID, et cetera, within the auto industry. We see, or we saw how typically the major auto producers every fall would introduce their um, no interest loans to consumers when they purchase vehicles. And they would typically come out in the fall timeframe, right? Um, and so the astute consumer realizing that then would wait until the fall timeframe to purchase their vehicle in order to take advantage of that promo at a lower price, right? As opposed to paying, you know, the MSRP or close to MSRP price during the year. So yeah, expectations play a big role in the establishment of reference price. So there are a whole bunch of things like that that serve to enable consumers to establish that reference price. So when the consumer then establishes that reference price, that again is that basis for comparison. So like I said before, as marketers, we can lean forward and we can put that into the mind of the consumer. As I mentioned to you before, you go to a Winners and you look at the price tag and you'll see two prices on every price tag, right? The competitor price and the Winners price. And the Winners price is always lower than the competitor. And what is that? It's an anchor and adjust kind of a process. It's all about establishing proactively that reference price in the mind of the consumer so that he or she will feel that they're getting a good price. So we anchor high and adjust low, right? That's the basis of it. And that anchor and adjust notion is a very prominent notion within psychology, by the way. Consumers are always, or people generally, are anchoring and adjusting accordingly with a variety of things, not only pricing, by the way. So it's a very prominent kind of a notion. Here, of course, we're looking at it within the context of pricing. So it is certainly key. So yeah, a whole bunch of things can impact it, ads, sales promos, and that kind of thing, as we spoke about before. We also realize, furthermore, another fundamental psychological component is this price quality heuristic, right? This mental shortcut, price quality heuristic, whereby the consumer sees a high price. What do they automatically think of? High quality. Is it a universal truth? Does it happen all the time? Is it a law? No, of course not. Maybe it does, maybe it's not. But it doesn't really matter too much because at the end of the day, as marketers, we realize that heuristic, that mental shortcut, is alive and well in the mind of the consumer. And so we realize that. And Monterey, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Professor, I handed by wrongly.
Okay, no problem. But now your hand is up, so you have to ask me a question or make a comment. Make a comment. You have to make a comment now. No? No comment. Okay. All right then. So anyways, we recognize that heuristic is very powerful and is alive and well in the mind of the consumer. Furthermore, when we look at the psychological aspects of this heuristic, we note some very important features here. And by the way, at the back end of today's class, we'll talk a little bit more about this important price-quality relationship. But when we look at it, we realize that the consumer will defer to price in order to make assertions about quality when there is an overall lack of information. In other words, when there's a lack of information within the purchase context about the quality of the product at hand, the consumer will revert to price and look at price, which is known, in order to make those assertions about quality. So it's an interesting relationship from that perspective. So they will make those assessments on quality based on price. And they will also defer to price when there is difficulty in making those quality assessments. So price is there, it's available to them, it's easy to look at, and so when the purchase context is complex, they'll place a lot of weight in price in order to make assertions about quality. So that's an interesting notion also. And so certainly though, from a marketing perspective, we can use price as we've spoken about before in order, if we want to convey that sentiment of high perceived value accordingly. So we can do it, and we can use it as a signal for prestige, for status, and of course for quality. So price then can be used in a very powerful way like that. And of course, as we've spoken about before, there are a whole lot of other psychological aspects associated with pricing. For example, we have what we call artificial price points that we have spoken about before. So what do we have? Like, what are some examples of that? Well, we see how some retailers will deliberately price and label their products as 0.99, whatever, 0.99. And what does that do? That depicts that possibly, and it is the case for some retailers, not so for others, but for some retailers, that the particular product is regularly priced and that it might go on sale in the future. If it's priced at 0.97, that artificial price point, it might indicate that it is currently marked down and that it might well be marked down further in the future. If it's, say, 0.93, it could denote something like it is currently marked down, it has been marked down subsequently before, and this is the final markdown, and there's no intention of marking it down any further, right? So the margin is at the smallest it'll go, in other words. So yeah, so we can use these largely for inventory purposes, for example, so we can do that for those purposes. It helps us to segment them, help us to identify different segments, price sensitivities, that kind of a thing. So it can help us in that regard. And so we also have this notion that we call odd-even pricing, or odd endings, as it's sometimes called. It goes by different ways. And that is basically that whole desire, as we have spoken about in the class before, to set our prices just below the next highest number. So in other words, we'll price it at $59.95 or $59.99 instead of $60 even. Why is that? Because upon seeing that right-hand most digit that is deliberately priced just below that next highest number, the consumer will automatically really look at that left-hand most digit, and they will attend to that left-hand most digit, and it will be more salient in their mind, and they will think that it will be much cheaper, much lower in price than it actually is. In actual fact, it's only maybe 1 cent away from the next highest, but that $59.99 will look and feel a lot lower in price than it actually is. And by the way, we see this very powerful psychological effect spanning the scale. So never will you see a house priced at $700,000, but you'll always see that same price, that same house priced at 699,999, right? Type of thing, right? So, goes across the scale from a cheap chocolate bar in a dollar shop to, a multi-million-dollar estate. So that effect takes place across the scale. So it's a very, very interesting effect, so to speak. Avaji, your hand is up. Did you have a question or was that a mistake? Okay. I'm not hearing anything from Avaji. Okay. So the next sort of major theoretical approach that we want to consider is what we call prospect theory. Prospect theory. And prospect theory here is essentially a theory that has its basis in economic theory, or economics rather. So prospect theory is based on that psychological notion that we call loss aversion. And as we have spoken about in class before, that psychological notion of loss aversion suggests that we as humans, we hate losing things. That whenever we lose anything or face the possibility of losing something, it is very painful for us to lose something, right? And that is loss aversion. And again, it's all about survival of the fittest. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would attend to those negative things or those big nasty animals that could kill us and eat us, as opposed to soft, fluffy little things, right? So, we attend as humans, it's hardwired, and we attend to those negative things more so than positive things. We're more averse to loss than we are to gain, obviously. And again, it's hardwired into us. We don't learn it. It's fundamentally hardwired into us as humans. So that is what we call loss aversion. We hate to lose it. So lose things. So in about the 1970s and into the 80s, economists, Nobel laureates, Tversky and Kahneman, took that notion and imported it and developed that notion in the domain of economics called prospect theory. And prospect theory essentially suggests that the psychological pain associated with a loss is greater than the psychological pleasure associated with a gain of equal amount. So, in other words, prospect theory suggests to us that if we lose 50 bucks, it's a heck of a lot more painful for us because we hate losing stuff. It's a heck of a lot more painful for us than the pleasure that we would get out of gaining 50 bucks, right? In terms of magnitude. So it's key. It's key to recognize that. And so we can sort of sketch this out, prospect theory, and have a look at it this way. So when we look at it graphically, we realize then that prospect theory, which again is, I think it's so important and it's such an elegant and relatively simple theory, and it's so impactful and so rich, and it has so much explanatory power that I do like teaching it to my classes. And again, when we look at prospect theory, it is captured by what we call a squashed S curve. And so we can lay it out similar to this. We have losses and we have gains. And on the vertical axis, we have pleasure on the top and pain at the bottom. And so here then, getting back to what I said, we can look at the scenario of comparing the pain associated with a loss of 50 bucks and compared to the pleasure that we get out of gaining 50 bucks. And so therefore, if we look at that first instance, we lose 50 bucks, it results as we, capture the amount of pain associated with that loss, it results in a set amount of pain. Conversely, when we gain 50 bucks, again, the magnitude is equal here. When we gain that same amount, we see the pleasure that's associated with that gain. And when we compare that pleasure that's associated with the gain to the pain that's associated with the loss, we see then that that pain is greater than the pleasure, right? So that's an important feature of prospect theory. So what does that mean then? What does that mean? Well, when we think about it, it has some very, very impactful, psychological, rich meaning for us. It means then that as humans, there's a different impact between gains and losses. And by the way, when we talk about price and we talk about the expenditure of money, that is a economic loss, by the way. So when we look at that, we realize then that gains and losses have different effects on us psychologically. So paying out a sum of money that is an economic loss is more painful than foregoing receipt of the same amount. Okay, so we realize that. We realize that again, the loss of amount is judged more painful than the potential pleasure we would get out of gaining equal amount. So that's key. So that has some very substantial implications for us then as marketers. We realize then that in terms of presenting the price to the consumer, we want to present it to the consumer as a discount off of a higher price, right? And so therefore, this is the behavioral economic substantiation, the psychological basis behind why we want to engage in this anchor and adjust process. It's all with a view to imparting to the consumer that loss is being minimized. So we're minimizing that very painful thing in the mind of the consumer, right? We also realize that as we look at the curve here, we see that their gains and losses have diminishing effects as they grow larger also, by the way. And that is the basis behind prospect theory, really, when you think about it. So these are very, very important takeaways, if you will, to realize when we talk about prospect theory. So by extension, then, as we recognize that, we can think about a very prominent extension that we call mental accounting, and it's sometimes called mental arithmetic. And this comes out of the work of a guy named Richard Thaler, 1985. And Thaler 1985 is a beautiful work. It's a beautiful paper, one of my favorite all-time papers, I think, actually. Just elegant and beautiful, and exceptionally insightful and impactful, I think. Richard Thaler, by the way, about 2-3 years ago, I guess it was, he won the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. So yeah, beautiful work. So he said some interesting things here, Thaler did. And when we look at sort of extending prospect theory into more precise combinations and gains and losses, there's some very important conclusions that can be drawn, as suggested by Thaler. And so, really, what he did was looked at various combinations of gains and losses in terms of how to segregate the gains and losses and how to integrate gains and losses. In other words, how to break them up or how to roll them all together. So he had to look at it from that perspective. And so typically then, there are numerous scenarios that came to light. For example, firstly, when we have the opportunity of presenting to the consumer a series of potential gains, for example, a gain of $20, gain of $40, gain of $60, for example, how best to present that to the consumer in order to minimize potential how to minimize the psychological effect of a loss, right? Or to maximize the psychological effect of a gain. How do we do that? How do we present it to the consumer? And so what Thaler suggests is that in this case, what we want to do then is to segregate multiple gains. In other words, we do not want to break down that into, we don't want to combine them into one big win. We want to provide for the consumer multiple smaller wins as opposed to one big win. It's psychologically more impactful in a positive sense that way. So in other words, we want to provide a win of 20, a win of 40, a win of 60 to the consumer, as opposed to rolling it all together and giving them one win of 120, for example, right? So we want to break it down that way. Furthermore, if we compare a small gain with a large loss, how do we combine that? And here again, we want to segregate that small gain out of that bigger loss. In other words, take, for example, you walk into a store to buy a washing machine, and you know that that price is going to be $500. So then the marketer then essentially has a choice, right? How best to present that price to the consumer? Should they present it in terms of a price tag of, say, $450 to the consumer? Or should they present it as price tag of $500 to the consumer, but you can get a rebate, use a rebate and get $50 back, right? So in other words, what's the better scenario? Take the $500, roll in $50 into it, a gain of $50 for the consumer, and reduce that price $450 and have that as an asking price, or ask $500 to the consumer and then give them back via rebate $50 afterwards. Well, the most impactful way is to segregate out that small gain. In other words, give them a small win as a result of it. And that is what Thaler called the silver lining. And that's what you want to do. And that really represents sort of the psychological power behind rebates and why rebates are used, right? So you give them that sort of $50 back. So the consumer then will look at it and say, yeah, that's a good thing. I'll pay $50 and I'll get $50 back. That's great, So that is psychologically powerful for them, more so than just a final price of $450. In other words, they feel like they're getting something, and that's a good thing. Furthermore, with the whole rebate structure, marketers, we can build in a few little hurdles along the way to make it a little bit more challenging for the consumer to take advantage of it. For example, you might set up something like, there's a particular time window in which to take advantage of the rebate. You have to mail in the original receipt. You need to fill out this form. You need to do this and that and this and that. So you make it a little challenging for the consumer. And so at the end of the day, what really happens in reality? The reality is that though all consumers will look at it and think about it and think it's great, the reality is that few consumers, in fact, do carry on with the rebate and take advantage of it. So it's a win-win kind of a thing for the marketer, right, or for the business, right? They essentially sell it for a lower price. They sell it for a high price, but they sell it for a lower perceived price, which is good, right? Because of those features. So that's the psychological basis behind rebates and why they're used so often. So that's how we want to do it when it comes to segregation. Conversely, according to Mental Accounting and Thaler, what do we want to do in terms of integration? If we have multiple losses that ensue, multiple expenditures, multiple prices, how do we do that? In other words, if we have, a potential loss of $50 potential 100, and potential 50. How best to present that to the consumer? Do we piecemeal it out and say, here's a, a P1 of 50, P2 of 100, P3 of, 50? Or do we roll it all together and say, here's the price of 200? What's the way to do that according to the research and according to mental accounting? Well, the way to approach that then is to integrate those multiple losses. Integrate the multiple losses. So it is less psychologically painful for the consumer to hurt once big than to hurt small a bunch of times, in other words. So that's what the research shows, and that's what we typically want to do. And by the way, we see that all the time in the auto industry. When you go to buy a new vehicle, for example, you typically have various choices of trim levels, and each trim level will go up by, say, $1,000 for various trim levels, right? So $1,000 for one, and you get, these attributes. Pay $2,000 and you get those plus a bunch of other things, and so on and so forth, right? As opposed to, a set amount for each individual attribute, right? Same with satellite TV. You order satellite TV and you have all these bundled packages of channels, right? It's all about trying to create those bundles, if you will, and integrate those losses, so to speak. So that's a key way of doing it. So what about if we have, a small loss compared with a larger gain? How do we do that? So if we have a gain for the consumer of $400, but a loss of $50, what do we do? Say to the consumer, okay, here's your $400, but we're going to have to charge you $50 for that. What's the best way to present that? Well, the best way to do that is to integrate the smaller loss with the larger gain. So in other words, what you want to do then, in order to minimize the pain and maximize the feel-good aspect, is that you want to roll in that smaller loss with the larger gain. So in other words, you want to say, yeah, instead of $450 loss, you want to say, here's a gain of $350 type of thing, right? And that is psychologically more impactful in a positive way. And so here then we have a situation whereby mental accounting, as articulated by Richard Thaler, allows us then as marketers to orchestrate various combinations of gains and losses in terms of how to segregate them or how to integrate them, depending on the magnitude and depending on, the magnitude relative to whether they're gains or losses. So it's very, very interesting and very impactful from that perspective. So broadly then, we see how we start off with a fundamental concept in marketing called in psychology called loss aversion, which was developed into prospect theory in economics, which in turn was developed into mental accounting again in economics by Richard Thaler. So we have that extension. So it's very, very powerful in that regard. Yeah, John, you have a question or no?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if this is right example or not. So, for segregate. So when I have like contract with the phone company, there's like let's say like $25 per month, and when they show all the time like if you do choose auto pay instead of like you pay every month, they do they put 5 gigabyte more or something like that. Can it be the example of segregate?
Okay, so what I've lost track of the example here now. What exactly are you saying? You have, if you have
So
a
you,
contract,
yeah, the phone contract, and
yeah,
if you pay $25 per month, then um, usually it's $25 per month for particular service. But if you set auto pay, then you get more service than how it should be.
what kind of more service do you get?
So like, let's say you just have like, you can just use data for 1 GB, then they add more GB per month if you set for auto pay. So can it be the example of the segregate?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that really captures the essence, the psychological essence of what we're trying to convey here at all, frankly. I think basically what that conveys is simply just some kind of a promotional effort to try to stimulate the consumer to subscribe to an auto pay with a view to ensuring that their payment will be received automatically on time from the consumer, as opposed to risking overdue payment or risking not getting paid. And from the consumer's perspective, it represents sort of an enticement, if you will, to take advantage of the convenience of auto pay. So I think it's more or less a bit of a sales promo, and it's all about trying to stimulate the consumer to make the payments on time, one way or another. And it's a way of recognizing that and rewarding the consumer for that. So, yeah, I don't think that what you described really relates to the psychological point that we are trying to convey here in terms of that quite well known notion that we call mental accounting. So, the answer is no.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Real good.
Yep. Okay. So recognizing that, then we can get into move slightly away from some of the pure psychological aspects here and think about some of the more low end tactical kinds of ways by which pricing actually occurs here. And there are different tactics that are available to us. I mean, we can engage in typically what we call more of a price line kind of pricing. And here we're talking about a bunch of things. Certainly we're talking about more of a pure price line pricing, which we'll talk about in a sec. We're also talking about price bundling a little bit here. And, price bundling, it occurs, where we bundle a bunch of products together where the bundled price for that bundle is typically lower in price than the price that the consumer would pay if each of those components were purchased separately, right? The sum of that price. So we have that bundling kind of notion that takes place. We also have what we call product line pricing. And here we have, how different variants of the brand can be priced accordingly within that sort of product line. So an example of something like that would be, you remember Apple has, I can't remember whether they still, I should actually check it out, but they had the iPod Nano, they had the iPod Shuffle, and the iPod, for example, right? And each one of those products had a different price point depending on the features or the attributes of each one of those products, right? Largely based on memory capacity and a bunch of other things, right? So they would have these price points built into that product line, right? So each product, each brand, if you will, each variant within that product line would have a different would have a different price level, right? And that's what we call product line pricing. So we have, say, look at toothpaste, for example, right? You have Crest, you have the high-end Crest Scope, Crest Total toothpaste, and then you have the low-end basic Crest, right? So that's another example of product line pricing. We also have complementary pricing, and I spoke to you about that before. I mean, you have, you go to purchase a photocopier and we can include some kind of complementary product, add a complementary pricing associated with it, such as paper. We'll give you, a price on a supply of paper or ink or something, right? Some kind of complementary pricing associated with that. So here we're talking about product line pricing. Value pricing, here we have a bunch of, options available to us related to value pricing per se. We talked about pricing to value, and that essentially is setting, your price at that ceiling, setting it pricing to value, setting it at the perceived value or reservation price. In other words, it's an attempt to try to maximize your margins, so to speak. So you have that going on. We can have what we call penetration pricing that we already spoke about. That sort of implies sort of a low cost, low price kind of approach. And again, we spoke about that. And then we have value pricing too. And value pricing really relates to consumer expectations. And here, we're, setting the price at a value or at a level rather that gives the consumer more value than they really expect, so to speak. Recognizing that value is the benefits that they receive for the price that they pay. So you can set the price to maximize value, so to speak, right? And we spoke all about that during our last session. And in fact, I even drew it on the board what value was and how to think of value. So yeah, we talked about that. We also have other somewhat low-end, pricing tactics, regarding differential pricing, and so here we basically, present price in comparison to other prices, as we've talked about with regard to reference price, for example, right? And we recognize that, consumer behavior is heterogeneous, and we recognize that different consumers are heterogeneous. So we recognize that. We recognize that different consumers have different levels of price sensitivities. And so therefore we can capture that and use that to our advantage, so to speak. There are different forms of differential pricing. We talk about price discrimination. We've already spoken about that. What is direct price discrimination? Again, it's about charging different prices to different consumers for essentially the same price, the same product. That's essentially what price discrimination is about. And we gave all kinds of examples of that last class, actually. We have what we call second market discounting. And here, this is an interesting thing. And when we talk about second market discounting, basically, it's where we have excess production that is sold to a secondary market at a discount. And we see that alive and well within the power sort of industry in this province. So, for example, in Ontario, with more and more consumers having their own personal solar panels and producing their own power, and solar panel farms and windmills, we see then that under those windy, sunny days, we see that there is an excess of electrical power being produced within the grid in this province. So then the question becomes, okay, well, since we cannot store it, and that's one of the problems with, solar and wind, you can't store it. So since we can't store it, what do we do with it? Well, what Hydro One does is that they will sell that excess production to a secondary market at a discount. And so they will stream excess power down into secondary markets like the New York, upstate New York, Vermont, Massachusetts. They will stream and sell that power to those secondary markets. And by the way, they will sell it typically at a price that is lower than cost of production, by the way. Yeah, because it costs a lot of money, more so than hydro, to produce electrical based on wind, for example. So they will sell it at a loss. And of course, the argument is, well, at least we're selling it and it's not being lost. And that's, I guess, a fair enough argument, right? So anyway, we have that kind of a thing, selling in a secondary market at a discount. We also have this other notion that we call periodic discounting, and that's basically where prices can vary over time. And again, getting back to the Hydro One and the power generation in this province, we see an example of that. When you use and purchase electrical power during the day, the rate at which you pay during the day, i.e. peak time, is more than what you would pay at night or on the weekends, off-peak pricing, right? What's that? Periodic discounting. So at night it's discounted, it's cheaper, in other words. So we have that kind of thing going on. And of course we have variable rate versus flat rate. Variable rate, like we've spoken about before in the class, we have, internet usage, going, the price of the internet usage going up the more you use it. And, data rates going up the more you use data, for example. Or you have other scenarios where you just have flat rate payments, right? So we have that kind of price schema in place also. So a bunch of tactics that we have. So it's all about presenting price using some of those psychological aspects we talked about before. So psychology coupled with some of these tactics really represents how we go about setting price. So in conclusion, then, we realize that the price-quality relationship is alive and well. Lest you think that I'm making this up, please don't. When we talk about the price-quality relationship and the heuristic with that, and the linkage, if you will, between quality and price, we see that that really has come out of the work of Ericsson and Johansson in the 1980s, who initiated a whole stream of very robust seminal research in that domain. So yes, they saw and we see that price absolutely can be viewed as a constraint. In other words, the more you spend on one thing, the less you have available to spend on something else, right? Almost like a opportunity cost kind of perspective like that, So yeah, we see that in rising fuel prices. Last night I filled up my truck with fuel and I had about half a tank. I filled it up half a tank and it cost me like about $105 just for a half tank of fuel in my truck. So that's $105 less than I have to spend on other things, right? So price is very much a constraint. It's a zero-sum game to a large extent. We also realize that price absolutely is a quality signal in the mind of the consumer. So that price heuristic is very much alive and well. And, consumers can have that, that signal of quality that comes with a high price, so to speak. And we spoke about that before. And so, yeah, we also recognize, interestingly, that it's a two-way relationship. It's a reciprocal kind of a relationship in that in the absence of a price, consumers will look at quality and they will infer that high quality, therefore it'll be high price, right? So it's a two-way relationship, which is quite important to realize here also. So yeah, absolutely, as I had spoken about before, we see then how price can be used as a proxy variable, certainly for quality in the absence of information about quality. So we see that going on. So therefore, we see then how Perceptions absolutely regarding price are critical. We see how psychologically a gain has a different effect on us than a loss, and how combinations of gains and losses have different psychological impacts on us. And we've spoken all about that. And we've examined theoretical perspectives that help us to understand that. But most importantly, we realize that when we are engaged in price setting, really, we need to think about all those things that we spoke about and understand all of those things if we are to engage in effective and efficient price setting. So it's important to realize that. Furthermore, we realize that price is, as I say, a value-laden construct. In other words, there is a tremendous amount of information packed into the price, as well as the way by which price is presented to the consumer is, as I always say, just as important, if not more important, than the actual price itself, because of all of the psychological aspects that we talk about. So really, at the end of the day, when you look at it from a very, practical perspective, it really is the key to profitability to a large extent and the key to shareholder wealth maximization. So indeed, it is very, very important. And yep, there is a lot to it. So therefore, next class, we'll be talking about promotion and customer relationship management. And at this point, you're well prepared to read chapter 9 of the textbook if you have not already done so, and to carry on with the Connect assignments that are patiently waiting for you to complete them. So with that in mind, I'll hang around in case there are any questions, but if not, I'll wish you all a very pleasant evening. Have a good night, everyone. Take care. Oh, and by the way, I hope you don't mind if we finish early. We're finishing a little early, 20 minutes early tonight. I hope you don't mind. Is that okay? You don't mind too much? Okay. Good night, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you. Yeah, good. Hey, is Diane still there, or is she have left? I guess Diane must have left. Anyways, yeah, good night, everybody. Good night, Ashkan. Good night, everyone.